It's Wizards versus Lesbians, a podcast for your ears.
Hello and welcome to Wizards versus Lesbians. My name is Isaac.
I'm Alexis.
And
I'm
today
Lee.
and today is a bonus episode, and we are going to be discussing The Last Unicorn by Peter Beagle. Our guest, once again, is Lee. Hello, Lee.
Hi, it's nice to be back.
Indeed, I'm happy to have you back, and I'm happy to be discussing this book, which I think is one of those perfect texts, which gives more back to you every time you go back to it.
Yes, absolutely.
It is traditional for the guest to do the plot, but actually, given what Lee said just before we started recording, I think we won't do that.
I will do the plot because
ahead.
I read this book long before either of you, when I was like 8. So, as the title suggests, there's one unicorn left in the world, and when she finds out that she is the last unicorn, she goes off on a quest to find the other unicorns. She is joined in this quest by Schmendrick the magician, who is extremely incompetent and has backstory for why, and Molly Grew, who is middle-aged and bitter, and is reawakened by the unicorn, and then a variety of adventures happen. Also, there's the Red Bull.
I think that Lee could probably have covered that much.
Well, I'm trying to do a spoiler-free plot summary.
That is true.
She finds out that they've been held captive by King Haggard, who is the personification of depression, basically, and she is going to have to go to some fairly extreme lengths that test her sense of self and what it means to be a unicorn, and also what it means to be in or not in a story.
Absolutely excellent. Cool. And I will ask, are there lesbians in this story?
No, but we have a variety of takes on where there could be lesbians.
Yes, as is traditional for bonus episodes that don't quite fit into the remit, we're going to see if we can't find a lesbian in here. And I also have a potential lesbian, so I'm looking forward to comparing notes about our various approaches to that. But wizards, this book is pretty much about being a wizard, among other things. But Schmendrick is possibly the one and only good wizard that we have encountered, and maybe we can talk about why that is as we go ahead. Why should you read this book?
It's very extremely good.
Yes, it's kind of a perfect book.
It's kind of a perfect book. I mean, the other reason to read it is if you watched the 80s movie, the incredibly 80s movie when you were a kid, the book manages to recapture much of the fun stuff of the movie, but is also beautiful and significantly less 80s.
Yes, was that a Ralph Bashki movie? Do I have that right?
I think it might be.
I think it was Rankin Bass.
It was Rankin Bass, that's right. It was Rankin Bass.
Gotcha.
That movie is so much better than it has any right to be.
It is, but
it's incredible. It's not quite as good as the book. It still manages to do the movie not quite as good as the book, but that's just because the book is an absolutely extraordinary book. I mean, we were discussing this before, Alexis and I, and I was like very hard pressed to come up with other contenders for best fantasy novel of the 20th century, which is there are a lot of fantasy novels published in the 20th century.
That's true. That is high praise right there. Yes, and Mia Farrow played the unicorn in the movie, I'm saying, which is very funny in a very sad kind of a way. Are there any reasons why you shouldn't read this book?
You don't like good things? You don't want to feel emotions.
This book, I cry every time at a particular part of this book, even now, which took me by surprise, even though it shouldn't have. And it's potent.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say is if you really don't like stories that make you cry, it will make you cry. It's not even like it's a tragedy. It's just it's got such intense emotions in it, and they're really wonderfully portrayed, and they get overwhelming.
Yeah.
I will say that like this book has a lot of gender in it. There's a lot of gender in this book.
Yes, that's true. This book has a lot of gender, and it is from the late 60s, and it is written by, as far as anybody knows, a very cishet author.
Yes.
To me, it has, like, I think the one of the things that it struggles with is a very sort of Jungian understanding of what gender is. And it doesn't solve that. It doesn't unpick that knot. And that might be frustrating, but I think that it doesn't think that it solved the problem either. So,
one of the things, I think that is very true, but one of the things that I really appreciate about this book is it is written in this very Jungian mythological fairy tale-y gender frame, but also, like a lot of good fairy tales as well, it is very clear that this is messed up. Like, it's not interested in doing serious gender apologetics.
Yeah.
It is, and this is part of why I was like unwilling to label any of the characters. Well, we'll get to my maybe proposal for that, but a lot of the characters lesbians, because it's like, well, no, for a lot of the female characters in the book, like, heterosexuality is one of their big problems. Like, Molly Grew
yes.
has real problems with her heterosexuality, and that is a major part of her character.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, slapping but secretly lesbian label on that does a disadvantage to the story.
Indeed. I agree completely. I'm eager for us to flip over our cards and say where we're finding our lesbians here.
Yes, are there any content warnings other than gender and emotions?
Getting old.
Gender, emotions, aging.
There's
gaslighting.
There's gaslighting. There's a lot
depression,
a lot of people behaving bad behavior in exactly fairy tale bad behavior ways, including attempted infanticide, cheating, gaslighting, definitely a bunch of other things along those lines. It's all presented in a very fairy tale-y way, but it is.
I think
definitely
maybe
there.
the most like upsetting thing that happens from sort of a modern Tumblr perspective is one of the characters forgetting who they are. Which would earn an unreality tag, I think.
Except but it's the unreality is heavily flagged in the book.
Yeah, I'm just trying to
Two people do get brutally murdered by a creature from mythology.
Oh yeah that's right.
Oh, they absolutely deserve it. But just noting,
off camera, but yes.
Yes. All right. So shall we then?
All right, on to the spoiler zone.
On to the spoiler zone.
Well, I had one of my wisdom teeth out today, but I'm recording these jingles anyway. I'm just a little bit stubborn at heart, but really that's not the important part. You see, I needed an excuse for why my things are not as good as what Peter sings. I'm making them up off the top of my head, but I think he could do better even if he was dead, which he thankfully isn't.
Also, that was the spoiler zone jingle.
So, all right. Who's everybody's candidates?
All right. Let's see. In what order shall we flip over our card?
I'll go first. Or you can go first, and then I can go, and then Lee can go?
Okay. You go first, then me, then Lee.
Great. So, my candidate is whatever Mommy Fortuna and the Harpy have going on. That is some classic toxic lesbianism right there.
Sure. My candidate is Prince Lear.
Oh,
yeah.
Prince Lear does kind of have like trans lesbian egg energy.
Absolutely, he does, or she.
My candidate, and to be clear, this is not a trans headcanon. This is just fulfills the role of the lesbian in the Wizards versus Lesbians story, is Schmendrick.
Indeed.
Who is very bad at performing his social role, and the fact that he is very bad at performing his social role leads both him and everyone around him to liberation from their social roles.
And, for that matter, he also is the one with the toxic wizard mentor.
That is true. That is very true.
Also, Leora, on Leora's behalf, I'm also nominating the spider because she thinks that she's Arachne, and Arachne and Athena also definitely had some sort of toxic lesbian thing going on.
That's deeply funny.
Yes.
No, that's very good.
Thank you.
Yes,
thank you, Leora.
I think the we can say that these theories have different levels of seriousness. I like the Mommy Fortuna and the Harpy thing.
I feel like there's definitely a sexual element to the whole I am keeping you captive, you are going to destroy me, I am going to taunt you, and keeping you captive is worth being destroyed, versus I am going to eat your innards.
Indeed.
As soon as you set me free. I don't know, I feel like there's some sort of weird psychosexual thing going on there.
I will absolutely accept that. There is a certain frisson there. I just yeah, and like Mommy Fortuna as a character to me is just that her particular kind of bitterness strikes me as like, it's not necessarily straight coded. You could arrive at where Mommy Fortuna is via a number of different paths. So
right. Though, and this, you feel free to edit this out because now I'm about to make it real weird. Your mom has always reminded me a little bit of Mommy Fortuna.
Oh yeah, no, I'm 100%. And the fact that my mom is tormented by her own heterosexuality in the way that Molly Grew is, probably, would be why I wouldn't have seen that, or wouldn't.
Yes.
That wouldn't have occurred to me as a reading, but that is, as you say, very much a personal thing. Yeah, and so here's my argument for Prince Lear being an egg, and like part of the way that the book has that kind of tragic ending.
Yeah.
Is that he? I'm just going to call him he because he's a he in the book.
Yes.
The first thing that he does upon seeing the Lady Amalthea is unconsciously imitating her.
Yes.
And his immediate reaction to suddenly being besotted with her in a way that like upends his entire life is to compensate so hard, to like go compet, like I'm going to be the most hero that has ever heroed,
Right.
Go really masked, but it's not working, like, and then he is able to enter the Red Bull's chamber because he's following the lady, because he's going the same way that she is. I think that, like, and even at the end, he doesn't want to become king, and he never wants to become king, even after he sees, that it's not going to be as awful as he might have thought it might be.
And yet he's stuck being king, and that's his tragedy, like in the text.
Yes, exactly. The fact that the unicorn will not speak to him at that point. I think that in another world, in another life, in a different kind of story, it could have gone differently for Prince Lear.
I find that very convincing.
There's a really interesting aspect of this, which is that Lear is a fairy tale prince, not of the Disney model, but of the much older model of fairy tale prince, which is also like the lesbian in Wizards versus Lesbians is often a character in that model as well. And we've become very bad at writing male characters in that mode. I think because of a bunch of the cultural revolutions that have been going on around gender and sexuality, we just really struggle with that now.
And that's why Utena was a prince, because all of the pre-existing princes sucked. It's also why we haven't had a convincing pro wrestling hero. For 20 years it's been anti-heroes. I blame Hulk Hogan.
And so anyway, I think there's some really interesting echoing, although also, in the Last Unicorn, of course, is part of this deconstruction. It's an early part of this deconstruction, but, the fairy tale prince does not get his fairy tale ending, and being a fairy tale prince is not enough. Anyway.
Indeed. And actually this, looking into Prince Lear's gender, kind of brings us to talking about Schmendrick's role in the text.
Yes.
Because Schmendrick is a person who can't be a wizard for most of the book, which makes him neotenous.
Right.
Which is another big gender.
Well, and he's very specifically neotenous. I mean, first of all, he's described as, round and foolish and oddly childlike and ageless. And then you later find out that he is so bad at wizarding that he has been cursed to immortality until he learns how to be a wizard. Because anybody who's that bad at something must, secretly be good at it, or must have the potential to be good at it.
And being a wizard is an overtly gendered marker in this universe. Women are witches, men are wizards.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it is and it should be noted, in support of, and you said this on a trans reading, but the other thing that Schmendrick's first reaction to Molly approaching the unicorn is overpowering jealousy.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
At her ability to just casually put her hand on this particular archetype and interact with it. And
which Schmendrick is never able to do.
Schmendrick is never once able to do, exactly. And we have a great, only, femininity happens off screen moment at the end where when the universe comes to Molly, I meant unicorn, but universe, sure, that works. The author and the readers aren't able to see that. Right at the end of the book. But it's when Schmendrick finally is like, okay, I'm going to, I'm actually going to become a wizard now. What he immediately does is jams Lear into the gender box.
Yeah.
That's how he takes up the mantle of wizard and follows in his mentor's footsteps.
Right. At which point, and then, seeing what he has done is what fills him with his magical power. And he becomes a wizard. Sure does.
So, I think that they're in that way, if he's a lesbian, it's kind of a tragedy for him as well, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I also think there's this is a minor aspect, but there's something weirdly sexually desirable about Schmendrick, but in a very non-straight way. Like the fact that he gets tied to a tree and the tree falls desperately in love with him, and he evades this because sexuality is terrifying by claiming to be engaged to a different tree, at which point the tree is tied to attempts a murder-suicide. And then this is not discussed again in the book. The unicorn comes and bails him out, and then that's it.
Yep, that's it.
I'm done with that tree. But, I don't know. It just had that vibe.
And shout out to the cartoon for including that scene and making it just as uncomfortable in cartoon as it was in the book.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, I think it's worth noting that we, when the one time that we see sort of Schmendrick, sort of experience or demonstrating something like desire, is when he's showing off for a quote unquote young girl in the town. Although it is also the case that this book calls any woman who is not like Molly Grew's age a young girl, so it's never entirely certain what is meant by that.
Yeah.
I mean, he's trying to impress a girl with magic tricks. It's sort of a very young. It's either a very young person's, way of flirting, or a through and through creep's way of flirting, which is part of the ambiguousness of his age, and of whether he's going to be a sexual subject or a sexual object.
It's true. It's not a very sexual book. I mean, it's all in the undertones, like a fairy tale.
But like as you said, there there is psychosexual. The psychosexual elements are in, because it's not a very sexual book, are more pervy as a result of this.
Yes, and I mean, I actually
whatever driving all the unicorns into the sea means.
Right. Well, and I mean, I think that's really prominent in the text. Partly, you have your core romantic couple, Amalthea, the transformed unicorn, and Lear. Throughout like their entire relationship, he never touches her.
Yes.
And
but at the same time, he's doing something which is kind of way more perverse, which is he's Pygmalioning her.
Right. And yes, but the thing is that I feel like that's something that the book is really doing specifically is, this is not supposed to be a perfect romantic relationship.
Of course, yes.
It's supposed to be a perfect fairy tale romance, but that's very different.
Yeah, no, I don't think this book does anything unconsciously. I'll just, put that out here.
There's something really interesting in this book. I mean, this is a major theme of the book that we haven't really discussed yet, so I'm just going to throw it out there, which is the difference between things that are in stories and things that are real. And some of the things in the story are real, and some of the things that are in stories are in a story that is in the story. And
there's some permeability there.
And particularly that the fantasy creatures are real. And
yes.
The humans are fully susceptible to the story that they are largely incapable of perceiving reality if it does not fit into a narrative that is already existing in their heads.
Creatures of night brought to light.
Yeah, well, like this is part of where the whole Jungian thing that's happening in this book is most apparent, is because the harpy and the unicorn are archetypes, and we are the humans in the book that can't see them are they're in Plato's cave, right? They're. And it's Mama Fortuna's trick is to allow them to see the archetype through storytelling. So, in fact, she's doing sort of the same thing that the author of the book is doing, but in a fucked up, toxic way.
Yes. Partly because she's doing it cynically, and the book, the narrative voice of the book is telling you, it. Is leading you to understand this as opposed to showing you something and lying to you. Showing you a dog and telling you it's a manticore, a satyr. I don't remember what the dog is.
The dog is Cerberus.
The dog is Cerberus, of course.
The satyr is a gorilla,
a monkey, a chimpanzee, maybe.
Anyway,
I don't recall. It doesn't really matter, is the point.
Right. The point is that, Mommy Fortuna is showing people the only way that people can perceive the unicorn as a unicorn in this, fallen age, is by putting an illusory horn on her.
Yes.
That's part. Mommy Fortuna is doing that to sort of further people's. Further people's being subject to the illusion, as opposed to the story, which is kind of Dream of the Red Chamber-esque in that it's sort of helping you see through illusion and understand the things that are illusory in reality.
Yes, exactly. We can, by looking at the unicorn in that way, we can also see what driving the unicorn into the sea is about, and also into the relationship between the Lady Amalthea and Prince Lear. The whole, the particular brand of depression that King Haggard has is that he is what he is disappointed about is that the real world isn't the unicorn, because he is capable of perceiving the archetypal beauty which is sort of the role that the unicorn plays here, is the archetypal sort of beauty, innocence, what have you, the perfection of nature. And since he has seen the unicorn, everything in the real world is as ashes upon his tongue. And so the only thing that he can possibly desire is to have everything that is a unicorn all for himself, so that he can, look upon it and look out into the ocean away from his world, his responsibilities as king, and instead into the sea to see that sort of endlessness, agelessness, immortality.
Yeah, though, let's actually, because there's an interesting contrast there with immortality. Because specifically, I mean, the thing about Haggard is that because he's aware that everything dies, and to him, because everything dies, it is worthless, and he is already, preemptive, it has already died inside him, and thus nothing can make him happy for very long. And then you also have Schmendrick, who specifically tells the unicorn that anything that can die is more beautiful than a unicorn. And so it's interesting to me, you have these two competing visions of what immortality means. One is that it's, the most beautiful thing, and the other is that it's functionally worthless, because it's taking you out of life.
Yes, absolutely. And that's sort of one of the major, the other major theme of the book being coming to terms with getting old.
Yes.
I think a lot of characters throw this around. Some people say, oh, the unicorn is more real than people. And some people say, oh, actually people are more real than the unicorns because, people are mortal. It's that the axis of reality and the axis of immortality is the sort of the point that it all comes down to is that, you should not strive to own or be immortal if you are mortal, because that leads to very bad things happening. But you shouldn't lose track of the immortal and the beautiful either, because that impoverishes you.
There's an interesting thing. This is backtracking a couple of exchanges, but you were talking about the unicorn, and specifically, there are a list of things you were talking about representing, and one of them was innocence, which is not wrong, but it's also, the book is very clear that the unicorn's innocence is not what we consider innocence, and culturally, and specifically is not female sexual purity, or female youth. That, the unicorn has absolutely no issue approaching Molly Grew, who is, as it turns out, actually just middle-aged, just right, old beyond her years, and has clearly been through a lot of shit. And she has that wonderful speech, which is heartbreaking, about where she's mad at the unicorn for not showing up when she was a little girl, but the unicorn does not give a shit. This is not an axis on which the unicorn is even capable of understanding reality, and that is very interesting to me. And it is an interesting thing to do with a unicorn. It's still an interesting thing to do with a unicorn, honestly, in terms of cultural narrative.
I agree. That's one of the sort of major places where the book departs. One of the major deconstruction points, if you will, from sort of the traditional understanding of these fairy tales. It not only does it say that, but it makes it clear that there are male unicorns and female unicorns, yes, and that they fucking have children.
Very rarely.
And it's very magical when they do.
Very rarely, but yeah, exactly. That also sort of but I think that the book is very very concerned with that specific distinction between sort of the idea of a unicorn and what it wants the idea of a unicorn to be, because it's turning the unicorn into right, Lady Amalthea, that's into a fair and unspoiled beautiful maiden that is the sort of the worst crime that is committed in the book, basically.
Do not mistake a human being for an idea. They may decide to try to embody it just to make you happy, and that might kill them. Find out who they really are.
And it is the thing that makes her lose her sense of what she actually is.
So one of the things that's interesting is, okay, so the unicorn's innocence has nothing to do with female sexual purity. But what the unicorn's innocence is that they never experienced regret or, or worry, really.
Or the passage of time.
Like, those are the things that they're really innocent of. And you notice, like, the book exists in this sort of weird timelessness with kind of an exception when she gets captured by Mommy Fortuna, and then, again, when she's turned into a human. And at those points, the book goes back into a more sort of standard narrative time instead of sort of floating from scene to scene. But I specifically, setting aside time, I specifically think it's interesting that the thing that makes the unicorn innocent is also the thing that makes her, very inhuman in a sense of, like, she's making a real effort to care about these two humans at all. And it's exhausting and frustrating. And she really kind of wishes that they could just go away and she could go back to not caring.
Yeah, the description of her struggling to remember that Schmendrick and Molly Grew exist, and her remembering their existence is this burden which is, like, spiritually and physically destroying her. And whenever she stops concentrating on it, it all becomes things that have happened long ago, and all of them are long dead. And this is just a story, which she is correctly perceiving that she is in a story, and that story is going to destroy her body and her soul. But, like, the process of that begins far before she gets turned into a human.
Lee was too embarrassed to say this on air, but when the unicorn is walking between Molly and Schmendrick, it reminded them of unicorns, the 2010s version. The way that she can't remember their names, and her presence is making things quite awkward.
That story, it is in chapter 1, when she leaves her forest and experiences a season that is not spring for the first time.
Yeah.
Like, that in and of itself is, like, an innocence that she can no longer go back to, right? She never gets pure spring again.
Yeah, no, this is absolutely true. I think that this is just a bit of a footnote to that point. But I think that, Schmendrick is also a character who exists outside of time.
As is Haggard, sort of.
And Molly Grew's connection to time is very weird, but different in a very different way.
Yeah, and, like, Haggard, it's hard to tell how long, he's, roughly how long he's been there. It's about a generation. But it seems like he's always been old. And like the unicorn, his perception of whether or not he remembers that things exist can shape, can shape his reality.
Yeah, but it is again kind of weird because, like, he brought those men at arms to his castle when they were young men, and now they're, like, doddering, and he was presumably already king when that happened, and now they're, like, extremely old men. And he, meanwhile, even though he, has the age of despair on him, is still physically young. Like, he is as dangerous and quick as a young man. And I think that you're meant to be implied that if he wasn't supplanted in some way, that he would probably be king forever.
Right.
What I was going to say was that I think that part of the jarring part, or something in this book that seems initially jarring, is actually working with the timelessness, is that characters who are mad or out of time get to make weirdly specific cultural references.
Yes.
From America,
Like the butterfly.
And Schmendrick get to reference, like, advertising slogans from the mid-century and stuff like that, which nobody else does.
And, well, Captain Cuddy gets to eat tacos.
That's true. Captain Cully's band gets to eat tacos. Though apparently it's implied that they're not very good.
It's that is a joke that doesn't quite land in the same way that it might have at one point. But yes.
Well, I think that's really interesting. Just from this is zooming way out of the story and its symbolism and into the story and the English oral tradition. So I apologize, but so I think a lot because I write fairy tale stories, and I think a lot about the connection between the English language oral tradition and the German language oral tradition and the fantasy genre, and a lot of the sort of core fantasy, what we think of as a core fantasy, is like one generation or less removed from the English language oral storytelling tradition, which most of these guys, like, you know, Tolkien and Lewis, or Charles Dickens for that matter, or E. Nesbit, all were told stories by their nannies when they were kids. And they are writing those stories down and reformulating them and restructuring them and doing all the normal things that you do when you retell a story. And you're not trying to do it verbatim. But their connection is direct. And basically, I kind of feel like The Last Unicorn and Peter Beagle is like the first generation where he doesn't have that. Like, he wasn't told these stories by his nanny, I think. I don't know.
He's a Jewish kid from America.
He's a Jewish American kid, right. But the connection to the English language oral tradition is through fantasy novels. And consequentially, to maintain the connection to the live oral tradition, it's now a mostly dead oral tradition, but to the vitality of the oral tradition, he has to get metatextual in a way that the others didn't. And so you have people like Captain Cully, who's like very concerned with being included in the Anglo-Saxon songbook that is being compiled by folklorists.
Mr. Child was a real guy was he. He collected lots of ballads over Dale and over Lee. He collected lots of ballads, wrote them down for you and me. Now a folk song by its nature must change over time with the culture and the language, now that blood and good don't rhyme. With the stories and the mores, now that incest is a crime. Mr. Child took some pictures, but he couldn't catch a song, for a song is in its motion as the ages move along. If you want to sing the real thing, you must sing it badly wrong.
Yes, but this works in a couple of different ways, because like Captain Cully is a character out of Panto, right? And if you're familiar with the continuing English tradition of Panto, it is, you know, your whoever out of work actors you can get up on stage and do, you know, comedic retellings of very few specific fairy tales, like Puss in Boots or Aladdin or Peter Pan or Robin Hood, and but to make it entertaining, you put in a bunch of like contemporary cultural references and jokes, which is what Captain Cully does. And that's sort of it's sort of the remnant of what the nanny is,
right.
Or
yes.
that kind of storytelling is at this point. It's kind of interesting that this is it's a tradition that still exists in England, but absolutely does not in America, unless you go to like the Christmas revels, or, you know, something precious like that. And but yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's he's sort of, and like the sort of the pantomime crew of outlaws who are in fact, you know, muscle for hire, as these people tend to be, you know, visited by the archetype.
Right.
You know, that's sort of the first iteration of something that's going to keep happening in the book.
Right, is when, you know, Schmendrick half accidentally summons the archetype of Robin Hood in his band, and it just breaks all of the outlaws.
Indeed.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, and it's interesting to look at sort of the ways that modern retellings or fairy tale style stories do or do not connect to the oral traditions from which they originate. Because I think now we're in the place where we have stories that are 4 or 5 generations removed, and those are pretty different.
Yeah, no, Tolkien might as well be the text at this point.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing, speaking of texts that used to be oral traditions, there's an interesting thing that I also noticed, which is that the Talmudic story about why Sodom was destroyed is in The Last Unicorn, which I have to wonder if that is intentional or not, given that Peter Spiegel is Jewish, but also, that story could come from anywhere. But the money that calls out to its previous owner, so they pay Schmendrick for the assassination, and then they send guys after him to take the money back, and they sing the magic song, and it makes the money call out to them, is supposedly in the Talmud story. The thing that Sodom did is they would each have coins with their own name on them, and they would give them to beggars that passed through, so everyone thought that they were rich and generous, and then they would secretly murder the beggar and redistribute the coins back to their original owners, because they were cruel and greedy.
Fascinating, yeah. I was not aware of that.
Yeah.
This one thing that is quite unfashionable about this book is that it is very explicit about the idea that wealth destroys your soul. All of the rich people in this book are bastards.
That's true.
Yeah, they really are. Even the very minor ones.
like the mayor and...
Yes.
Love to see that. Love to see more of that.
Well, and actually, so this is really interesting because I think it also sort of ties into this theme of immortality. The thing that, and is a kind of a good comment on our current rich people, the thing that makes the rich people of Hagsgate, at least the town of Hagsgate, awful, is that they're so they are so afraid of losing their prosperity that they are unwilling to have a future.
Yes, exactly.
They're not having children because the prophecy says that it's one of their children that will, it's one of them that will bring down Haggard and thus the fortunes of the town. So they've chosen. I mean, of course, they're mortal, they're aging, but they've still chosen this sort of idea that they can opt out of the passage of time and freeze themselves into wealth.
Yes, and if they do accidentally have a child, they will refuse to care for or help that child on the off chance that child grows up to disrupt their stuff. And it is funny to reflect that Peter Beagle, who would have been a boomer, would have been talking about the generation before him when he was thinking about this.
Well, yeah. This is not a conflict which is limited to specific times and places.
Right.
It is certainly
the conflict
not, no.
between the people who are adults now and have things and the children who will get things and who represent in some ways the deaths of the adults that raise them.
Yes. But I'm feeling quite Schmendricky being 40 and still waiting for things.
I gotta say, Schmendrick suddenly became super relatable when I was in grad school.
Well, there's an interesting thing too about the Hagsgate is that they are so craven, they're so greedy, right, that they want to hire Schmendrick to assassinate, as it turns out, Lear, because he might fulfill this prophecy that would cause their town to lose their wealth. But they're also so cowardly and tight-fisted that they hire him to assassinate this guy and then immediately go try to stab him to get the coins back.
Yes.
There's no time for him to accomplish this task at all. It's just, they're like, oh, but 20 gold coins is just a lot of money. I just want that back.
Yes.
And that is a really fascinating bit that they can't even quite manage conspiracy because they're too selfish.
And
indeed,
yeah, and that is the root of their curse. I do enjoy that when you get to see Hagsgate again after it has been completely trampled by unicorns, and their wealth has been thoroughly destroyed. That they're all. It's not that they're happy, but like they all seem a little bit more. The worst has happened, and so like they no longer quite have that dread hanging over them. They're still assholes. Indeed. They're still like real mad that Schmendrick, who they tried to murder, isn't going to magically rebuild their town.
My very favorite thing, or not my favorite thing, actually, it doesn't make the top 10, but a thing that I enjoyed is Drain's attempt to be like, "Oh, my son!"
Yes.
when King Lear at that point comes back through town.
My son, who I exposed and then chased the cats off so that he wouldn't even be warm.
Yeah, but it's like immediately understanding that, if there's a way that he can control this narrative or, change the story to where he is like a character who deserves largesse, then he might still be able to hang on to some of his prosperity.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah,
that's very good.
Isaac wants to ask a question now.
I wanted to ask a question. Speaking of like things about this book that are where it's struggling. You think it's a little misogynist in places?
I don't.
There's
just because Molly Grew is. I think that it is more because it is dealing with the ways in which archetypes are cruel to women. But part of Molly Grew is one of the characters who in some ways gets like the happiest narrative out of everybody, even Schmendrick, really.
Yeah, I'm thinking of just sort of little things like the Blue Jay's wife, and the various witches doing witch things. The Blue Jay's wife bit is like it feels to me like there are a few things in this book that are just sort of lifted part and parcel from like Borscht Belt bits, just like Jewish humor, which is misogynist.
Speaking of oral traditions, my feeling is that it is addressing a bunch of stuff about gender and sex, which includes misogyny, and it is not interested in doing a point-by-point refutation. It is interested in entering into a tradition, which definitely includes misogyny, and it does so, and I don't know. Just as a personal bias, I think that's better. But
sure.
I do think that if you want to write a call-out post about this book, you will definitely get several bullet points under your misogyny header. It is not like, it is about how stories mess up people's lives and destroy them, and the stories that mess up people's lives and destroy them are both are misogynist, and this book is one of them. So it is in the thick of it, and it does not come out either clean or unbloodied.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's very convincing.
Just wanted to bring it up. It's also something that sort of fades as the book continues and becomes more serious.
And there's an interesting thing about the structure of the book, speaking of fading and becoming more serious. It's almost like it's a series of short stories in which each short story is twice as long as the previous one, and then eventually you get halfway through the book and it becomes the entire rest of the book.
Which is when the unicorn becomes human and enters the story like the rest of us.
Right. And which is almost exactly at the halfway point of the book. But the first chapter is just about the unicorn alone, and it's really just this vignette which works completely on its own, about a unicorn realizing her mortality and what that means. And then the next two chapters are she gets captured by the carnival and Schmendrick gets her out, right? and that is its own whole complete storyline with its own set of characters that, other than Schmendrick and the Unicorn, we don't see again. And then the next 4 chapters, I think, or maybe 3, is like Molly Grew and the Bandits and that whole thing. And it just sort of keeps getting longer and more complicated. But it's also like the first story is very elemental and pure, and it gets messier, and there are more characters and there are more names and there's more story with each iteration. And I think that's a really interesting structure.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you say that, none of these characters show up again, which is true, except that Mommy Fortuna's Carnival shows up in Amalthea's nightmares.
Yes.
So, it's another way of marking that the unicorn half of the book and the Amalthea half of the book kind of exist in different realities.
Indeed. So we have encountered the sort of recapitulating stories of increasing length narrative structure before, and we've also encountered the part of the book that is the longest and slowest is the part about depression thing before.
Yes.
And I would like to point out that this book is an example of the fact that you can pull that off.
Yes, it helps that the book is fairly short.
It does help the book is fairly short, but even that, I forget every time that half of the book is in Hagrid's castle.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't feel that way, It somehow manages to make Hagrid's castle be this quite long, and by the sort of picaresque fairy tale feeling that the book has led us to expect, suddenly that stops and we're just stuck there, and it pulls off that feeling without boring you, and that's partially just because it's a fun book, and things keep happening even inside this sort of depression zone. But yeah, no, it's a very difficult thing to pull off, but it can be done, and this book is evidence of that.
I think that part of what makes it work is that there are characters who are active. Part of what makes it work is Lear, who's sort of going around being funny.
Yeah,
he's writing bad poetry and failing to peel potatoes and killing an escalatingly dangerous set of monsters and bringing home each one and then going, well, now I just feel cringy.
It's funny, the whole, it's the fun adventures are still happening. It's just that they're happening back out in the world, and we get we get signs and portents of them, but we're not the ones out adventuring anymore.
Right? Yeah. Mostly we get Lear comes back and is like, well, I successfully killed the ogre. That had this whole very fairy tale-esque thing, and that's actually a great moment where Lear's riding back and he's singing, and this ogre's head that he's tied to his saddle to show off his heroism is singing along in a terrible harmony.
Yes, that is in fact the original ogre's brother-in-law.
Yes.
But yes.
That's right. I forgot. Because it keeps escalating.
Yes, he's described as singing in a falsetto bass,
yes,
which is a terrifying and difficult to picture concept.
And again, this is another example of how there's these two realities in the book, because that's such a fairy tale thing, and then it becomes a joke as he enters the reality, and then it becomes something of a threat to the status quo that he's singing at all. And then, Amalthea always looks at his trophies and is just and she doesn't even say anything, but it always makes him feel gross.
Yeah. Bringing the dragon's head upstairs to her and it being the best thing in the world until he gets near her and then he realizes that he's just holding this disgusting lump of meat.
Right.
Trans narrative ? Anyway,
I wanted to ask you a question, Isaac, because
you
have specific expertise in this topic. What do you think about the use of lyrics and song in the text? I mean, there's a lot of rhymes and songs in this text.
Yeah, no, in fact, some characters will just go full Shakespeare and end their monologues with a rhyming couplet.
Yep.
And yeah, no, my opinion about that is that it's much, much harder than people think it is. And that if you happen to be good at it, which Peter Beagle is, then you should flex. Because again, this is part of, it harkens back to these like old fairy tale traditions also, as you pointed out. But also it's like, it's not something that people, it's something that I would only encourage people who are very good at it to try. Which, I mean, and in fact, the book sort of lampshades that by making Lear not a particularly good poet.
Yes.
But yeah, no, I think it's just because the author is a songwriter, and so is going to use that as part of his bag of tricks. I read the audiobook, which is read by the author, who is an excellent performer of his own work and also sings his own songs. For some of them don't have melodies, but some of them do. I will at the end of this episode put my version of the "I Knew I Loved by the Way I Behaved" song, which I worked out a while ago.
You did a real good rendition. Yeah. Based on his lyrics, and also because he does sing that one in the audiobook. Yeah,
right? based on his melody is what I was trying to say. There is which you can sing it to the tune of the Ash Grove, as we often did. But when I was like, oh, it's not actually to the tune of the Ash Grove. Interesting. But yeah, no, I think it's just it enhances things, and Tolkien actually did the same thing.
Yeah,
we kind of forget that, and Tolkien was also good at it. So
I don't forget that.
Yeah.
My younger brother used to make up tunes and like perform some of the songs.
Yeah, I think that it's something of a lost art, and I would welcome contemporary fantasy authors to make stupid little songs up.
Yeah, except that most of the time the problem is that most of the poetry and songs in fantasy novels are clearly the author thinks that they're a really good poet, and it's supposed to be really beautiful poetry and like, some of the best poetry, and it so often isn't.
Well, this is a point that I would like to make about why Schmendrick is a good wizard, up until he becomes a real wizard and starts kind of being a bad wizard.
Yes.
IMO, which is that before he is a real wizard, in quotes, he is a clown.
Yes.
Before he fully internalizes the idea of we must protect the fairy tale and the narrative and the hero's role and the wizard's role and all of this, he recognizes what a wizard actually is, which is a character on the periphery who helps and entertains and does tricks and falls on his face. And I think that if you're going to write rhyming verse in meter, then you should be very aware that you're going to be a clown. Mm-hmm. And you will produce better work as a result of this.
I agree. Though I want to say with Schmendrick, the thing is, he doesn't realize that that's what a wizard is supposed to be. That's what he is. And he describes himself as a magician, not a wizard. And he's deeply sad about it. Like, this is the gap in his life, the one hole in his life that cannot be filled, is that he's not a real wizard. And so he's going around helping, rescuing unicorns and things like that, but and clowning. But he's, that's not what he wants to do. And when he becomes a wizard, I wouldn't say that it's when he becomes invested in protecting the status quo and preserving the fairy tale. It's when he realizes that he can manipulate the fairy tale to make other people do what he wants.
He who controls the narrative controls the world. That was the theory behind the short-lived wrestling company Control Your Narrative, where people who'd been thrown out of other wrestling companies tried to go to reclaim a semblance of dignity. Unfortunately, the narrative around them was that they were a bunch of losers, so it didn't really work out.
Right? It's when because that's very true. This could be two different kinds of fairy tales. This could be the fairy tale of the unicorn who became a princess and the princess who fell in love with the prince and they lived happily ever after. And what he does is, and that's clearly where the story is going. And Schmendrick realizes that, manipulates Lear into not allowing it to happen, even though it's the one thing Lear wants the most, by reminding Lear that he's a hero in a fairy tale, and thus denying him his fairy tale ending and turning it back into a different kind of story.
I agree.
And, that's what a wizard is, right? It's somebody, and, like, that's what the wizards are in these books usually. It's people who know how to manipulate a narrative to get other people to do what they want.
Yeah. And, like, speaking as somebody who has been both a wizard and a clown, and sometimes both at once.
But not a lesbian.
And, but not a lesbian, no. And somebody who, and also as somebody who has friends who are clowns who desperately want to be wizards.
Yes.
I've seen this in life. People who are incredibly gifted clowns who can't go that way because it's not important enough.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say, to paraphrase Leonard Nimoy in that one Simpsons episode about the monorail, the world needs laughter. Anyway, I didn't actually have any deep thought to finish that sentence.
It's fine.
The magician and the fool are right next to each other in the tarot deck. I would simply cast spells rather than walking off a cliff, but I was built different.
Appropriately enough.
But, that's, it's interesting to me that the story, nobody gets a happy ending. I mean, Lear gets the saddest ending. Schmendrick thinks he has a happy ending, but, he's changed and not for the better. The unicorn gets to go back to being a unicorn, but, now she's
forever changed.
She's forever changed. She has experienced all of these human emotions, which means that she can never be truly timeless again. And Molly Grew actually gets a pretty good ending in that, she gets a sort of she gets to go off and have adventures and also gets the cat.
Yeah, and she also gets her conversation with the unicorn, which we will never know.
Never know what it was. So, it's, you could argue that I guess going off and having adventures with Schmendrick, as now that he is a wizard, may or may not be as happy of an ending. But, what she always really wanted was to go off and have adventures. And the first time she tried that, it resulted in her just being the extremely bitter quasi-girlfriend, quasi-wife of this terrible bandit guy. A
clown who desperately wants to be a hero.
Yes.
Incidentally.
And he actually gets a happy ending of all of his fellow outlaws except for his best friend.
He turns out to be a clown.
Right, he turns out to be a clown. He and the one other outlaw who doesn't immediately go home as soon as they're pardoned, like, they go off and become minstrels. And are, something like reasonably popular in the provinces or something like that.
Exactly.
So, in some ways, maybe they get the happiest ending, giving up on being a hero and getting to become a clown.
Yes, this, of course, the Nightbird's Feather keeps coming up when we talk about heroes. And in fact, it is reading the Nightbird's Feather that has helped me to be extremely skeptical of everything that Schmendrick says about heroes.
Yes, absolutely.
But, the people who have taken up the role of being the main characters don't have a happy time.
Yeah.
As a general matter.
Yeah, and the book makes it very clear that Schmendrick is being manipulative and disingenuous, because there's the whole thing where Molly's like, why are you doing this? Just let them have the happy ending. And he's like, I didn't do anything.
Yes, that's exactly it. Actually, really, there's something so fundamentally relatable about that part where Schmendrick is like, yes, I only do care about the power.
Right.
I don't know if this is relatable to anybody, but if you've ever said the thing that you don't want to say in a way that makes it seem like you're joking,
yes,
I think that's probably that.
Right, and but that's not 100% true, because he's like,
it never is.
Right, no, exactly, it never is. He's expressing one facet of himself, and it's the facet who's about to who's really getting to drive right now. But he then walks it back a little bit by going, no, that can't be true. Otherwise, why would I have all these problems?
Yeah.
And of course, he is also.
I love this book.
I know, me too. And of course, he is saying that he doesn't care about anyone or anything as he's carrying Molly Grew. So.
Yes. Do we have any final observations about it before we wrap up? Since we're getting to about time, I would say.
It's extremely good.
I want to just put in that this book does my favorite thing, which I've discussed in I think the Breath of the Sun was the latest one, where it throws in a fake etymology.
Yes. Oh yes, mirror.
Yes, miracle is spelled with 2 R's because it derives from mirror,
yes.
Which is just beautiful.
It is, and Schmendrick says it with such confidence.
Yes.
Which is, again, it's another interesting point, because Molly Grew is the one who gets closest to correctly spelling miracle.
Indeed. But I think, I just wanted to throw that in there. And also the really good Yiddish cursing that Schmendrick does early in the book. But anyway, Lee, do you have any final observations?
I think it's very good, and you all should read it. And also, it occurred to me that the only other book which I might consider my favorite fantasy book of the 20th century, other than this one, is called Travel Light, and it also has a unicorn on the cover. So it may just be that I have a very high opinion of all books with unicorns on the cover.
Well, and actually, Travel Light is also a book about different kinds of narrative time.
Yes, it is. Travel Light overlaps with this book in so many ways that makes me think that it is very likely that Peter Beagle read it before he wrote this book. Anyway, yes. It's very good. But
it's
that's
very
a different podcast episode.
It's very good. I'm sort
also
of sad that now that the that's true. We should do that one for the podcast. I'm sort of sad that now that the cartoon has mostly faded from people's memory, childhoods. That the book has I feel like the book is fading out of people's consciousness, and to me that is very sad, because I feel like it should be as ensconced in fantasy readers' canon as Tolkien.
Well, we'll do our best to bring it back to people's attention, and we will do it with Travel Light at some point, and we'll do it with The Princess and the Goblin at some point.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good one. Yes, 19th century, but I think. But
yes, good. Anyway, so yes, I agree, and also I would probably have not read this book if Alexis had not loved this book so much.
I love this book.
Thank you, Alexis,
so
for bringing
much.
this book into my life.
You're very welcome. There was a while where I used to always own 2 copies of this book so that I could always just easily give a copy away if somebody wanted to read it. I've moved so often that now I'm down to 1 copy, but I should get a couple more copies.
Yeah, and also, I came into this expecting to be sort of, but this is a little bit of a tangent, but I don't know if either of you can relate to this, but I found, despite the Molly Grew, you come to me when I am this moment, which still makes me cry. Mm-hmm. I found the stuff about aging scarier when I was younger.
Yeah. Well, now it's sort of comforting because now it's offering that as it's making it clear that the alternative is actually worse.
Yeah, and in a really persuasive way, which some books that try to do this don't.
Yeah, that's something you're right, actually. And I'd meant to say this and during the podcast, and it never did. But this book, I think, is one of the most convincing texts arguments against immortality.
This is still the podcast.
Yeah, I know, but I was going to say it earlier in the podcast before we get to the wrapping up zone. So
yes, it really does make its point in a really compelling way. Particularly with the citizens of Hagsgate.
Yeah,
I would say,
and also with Haggard.
Yeah,
but it also
and Schmendrick.
And this happens. I think this is the case for very good fiction. It contains its antithesis, right? Yes. The unicorn at the beginning of the book is immortal and is perfectly happy.
And it's great, yeah.
And it's great. And there's nothing wrong until things start, of course, going wrong. And then there's the whole book. But, it isn't. I think maybe this is part of the reason why it's more convincing, is that it's not like ducking the idea that paradisical immortality is good. It's just like going, but is that really going to be you? Is that,
Right.
Turns out that's a unicorn, not a human being. Absolutely. But yeah, no, it is the sign of a great book that you can go back to it once every like 5 or 10 years and get something new out of it.
Or 1 or 2 years in my case.
Yes. And I felt like I understood this book better on this last reread than I ever had before. Which is, it's an interesting thing.
Getting older, actually, I mean, I feel like I get something new out of the book every time I read it, but I do feel like getting older has definitely allowed me to get more out of the book.
Indeed. Well, we should actually wrap up at this point.
Yep, we've run over a bit.
Yes. I love this book. You should all read this book. Get other people to read this book.
Yes. All right. And this is a bonus episode, so we don't even know what we're recording next, but we'll figure it out.
Thank you for joining us, Lee. I really appreciate it, as usual.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. I really enjoy being on the show.
Alrighty. Bye, everybody.
Alrighty. Bye.
When I was a young man and very well thought of, there was naught I could ask that the ladies denied. I nibbled their hearts like a handful of raisins, and I never spoke love, but I knew that I lied. But I said to myself, there's none of them know the secret I shelter and savor and save. I wait for the one who can see through my seeming, and I'll know when I love by the way I behave. The years they passed over like clouds in the heavens. The ladies went by like the whisk of the wind. I charmed and I cheated, deceived and dissembled, and I sinned and I sinned and I sinned and I sinned. But I said to myself, there's none of them know there's part of me pure as the whisk of a wave. My love may be late, but you'll find I've been faithful, and I'll know that I love by the way I behave. At last came a lady, both knowing and tender, who said you're not at all what they take you to be. I betrayed her before she had quite finished speaking. She swallowed cold poison and jumped in the sea. I say to myself when there's time for a word, as I gracefully grow more debauched and depraved. True love may be strong, but a habit is stronger, and I knew I had loved by the way I behaved. And I say to myself when there's time for a word, as I gracefully grow more debauched and depraved. True love may be strong, but a habit is stronger, and I knew I had loved by the way I behaved.